America is drowning in $36 trillion of debt. China, $15 trillion. Japan owes $10 trillion. Look at Germany, $3 trillion in the red. The United Kingdom, same story, $3 trillion. France is even deeper at $3.5 trillion. Here's the crazy part. Every single major country on this planet is buried in debt. When you add it all up, we're talking about $317 trillion in total global debt. That's 330% of everything the entire world produces in a year. Think about that for a second. Even if we took every single dollar earned on Earth, it wouldn't cover the total debt. We'd need 3 full years of everyone working, producing, earning with absolutely zero spending just to pay it all back. But here's the mind-blowing question that nobody seems to ask. If literally everyone is buried in debt, then who's the lender? Who actually owns $317 trillion worth of assets? Because if the whole world owes $317 trillion in liabilities, debt works both ways. For every person borrowing, there has to be someone lending. If America owes $36 trillion, that means someone out there holds $36 trillion in claims against America. So, if the entire world owes $317 trillion, then someone must own $317 trillion in global assets. Who are these people? The answer is going to reveal the biggest wealth concentration machine in all of human history, and it didn't happen through war. It didn't happen through stealing. It happened through a system where the majority borrow and a tiny minority lend, where interest keeps piling up forever, and where mathematically, the debt can never actually be paid off, so it just keeps growing and growing while wealth flows straight to the top. I'm going to show you exactly who holds this $317 trillion in global debt, how the system creates debt without creating the money needed to pay it back, why this isn't some accident but actually by design, which specific institutions and people are profiting from this never-ending debt cycle, and why this whole system is eventually going to crash, but only after they've extracted every last dollar possible. Understanding this isn't just about money and numbers. It's about seeing how the global debt system is literally the tool that concentrates wealth into fewer and fewer hands while making it look completely normal and unavoidable. Before I reveal who actually holds all this debt, you need to understand what debt really means in today's system. Most people think debt works like borrowing from a friend. You need $10,000, so a bank lends it to you. The bank already had that $10,000 sitting there, and when you pay them back, they get their $10,000 back plus some extra interest on top. But that's not how modern debt actually works. When governments borrow money by issuing bonds, the money literally doesn't exist beforehand. The actual act of borrowing creates brand new money out of thin air. Central banks or regular commercial banks buy government bonds by creating money from absolutely nothing, just digital entries in a ledger. Let's say the US government needs $1 trillion. They issue Treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve says they'll buy $500 billion of those bonds. Regular commercial banks grab the other $500 billion. So where does the Federal Reserve get this $500 billion from? They don't actually have it. They create the money by literally typing numbers into a computer system. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet goes up by $500 billion in assets and $500 billion in liabilities. Commercial banks do basically the same thing through something called fractional reserve banking. That money didn't exist anywhere before. It only exists now because someone bought the bond. When the U.S. government borrows $1 trillion, that $1 trillion gets created through the actual process of borrowing. But here's where it gets really important. Only the original amount is created. The interest payment is never created. If the government borrows $1 trillion at 5% interest, they have to pay back $1 trillion plus $50 billion in interest every single year, but only $1 trillion was ever created. So where does that $50 billion for interest come from? It has to come from somewhere else, either from borrowing more money in the future or by taxing the money that already exists. This creates a trap you can't escape. Total debt will always be bigger than the total money supply because interest is owed but was never actually created in the first place. The system needs debt to keep growing forever just to pay the interest on the debt that already exists. This isn't a mistake or a flaw. This is exactly how they designed it to work. Now let me break down who actually holds all this debt. The answer falls into four main groups: central banks, big institutional investors, foreign governments, and super wealthy individuals. First group, central banks. The Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion in U.S. government debt. The European Central Bank has $5 trillion in European government debt. The People's Bank of China holds $3 trillion in Chinese government debt. When you look at central banks around the world, they're holding around $25 trillion in government bonds. That's about 8% of the total $317 trillion debt. But this is the foundation of everything because central banks create money from nothing to buy government bonds, which lets governments spend way more than they collect in taxes. But here's the real question: who actually owns these central banks? The Federal Reserve isn't owned by the government. It's a private institution owned by member banks. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks issue shares to regular commercial banks. Banks like JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo get a 6% dividend every year on their Federal Reserve shares. When the Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion in government bonds and collects interest, that interest money ultimately flows to the private banks that own the Federal Reserve. Most people think the Federal Reserve is part of the government. It's not. It's a private banking system created back in 1913 to let private banks profit from government debt. Look at the Bank of England. Created way back in 1694, it was specifically set up as a private company to lend money to the government. The government needed money to fight a war with France. Parliament gave permission to create the Bank of England as a private business. The bank loaned $1.2 million to the government, and in return, they got the exclusive right to create currency. Right from the start, central banks existed to make private bankers rich by creating government debt. The ownership structures are more complicated now, but the basic mechanism is exactly the same. Central banks create money, lend it to governments by buying bonds, and then collect interest that taxpayers have to pay. Second group, institutional investors. We're talking about pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and sovereign wealth funds. These massive institutions are holding around $120 trillion in global debt. Pension funds alone hold $50 trillion. Insurance companies have $35 trillion. Mutual funds control $25 trillion. Sovereign wealth funds hold $10 trillion. But who really owns these institutions? Pension funds are supposedly owned by the workers whose retirement money they're managing, but workers don't actually control anything. Fund managers run everything, and they get paid based on how much money they're managing. Insurance companies are owned by shareholders. Companies like MetLife, Prudential, and AIG are publicly traded corporations, but stock ownership is super concentrated. The richest 10% of households own 89% of all stocks and bonds. So these insurance companies are effectively owned by wealthy people. Mutual funds like Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street manage $20 trillion in assets. Vanguard is supposedly owned by the people who invest in their funds, but management has all the real control. BlackRock and State Street are publicly traded companies, with ownership concentrated among wealthy shareholders. The pattern you see across all these institutional investors is that control sits with a small management class, and the actual money benefits flow mostly to wealthy people. Third group, foreign governments. Foreign governments are holding around $30 trillion in debt from other countries. China holds $3.2 trillion in foreign assets, including $850 billion in US Treasury bonds. Japan is holding $1.1 trillion in US Treasuries. Why do foreign governments hold other countries' debt? It's all about the trade system. When China sells $500 billion more stuff to America than it buys back, China ends up with $500 billion in dollars. So China uses those dollars to buy US Treasury bonds. The system works out for both sides in the short run. America gets affordable products, and China finances those purchases by lending the money right back. But it creates long-term dependency. Inside China, who actually benefits from holding trillions in foreign bonds? Not the average Chinese factory worker. The Chinese government holds these bonds, and they're controlled by the Communist Party elite, fourth group wealthy individuals and family offices. The top 1% globally hold around $40 trillion in financial assets, and a huge chunk of that is in bonds. The top 0.1% hold $20 trillion. The top 0.01%, we're talking about roughly 500,000 families around the world, hold $10 trillion. These families' names, like the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Waltons, the Mars family, the Koch family, the Saudi royal family, they're holding massive portfolios of bonds. When you have $10 billion in wealth, you buy government bonds, corporate bonds, safe assets that pay steady interest. A family sitting on $10 billion in bonds earning 4% is collecting $400 million every single year in interest income. They're not working. They're not producing anything useful. They're just collecting $400 million per year from interest paid by borrowers. This is how wealth concentration through debt actually works. The wealthy lend to everyone else and collect interest payments that never stop. That interest gets paid through taxes, through corporate profits squeezed from workers, through mortgage payments. Wealth flows from the billions at the bottom to the few at the top through the debt system. Now let's total up these four groups. Central banks are holding $25 trillion. Institutional investors have $120 trillion. Foreign governments hold $30 trillion. Wealthy individuals control $40 trillion. That adds up to $215 trillion out of the total $317 trillion. The remaining $102 trillion is spread across smaller institutional investors, corporate treasuries, middle-class people with bond funds in their retirement accounts, and various other entities. But even this remaining portion is mostly held by wealthy people because wealth itself is so concentrated. The bottom 50% of humanity holds almost zero financial assets. They hold debt instead. They owe mortgage, student loans, credit card debt, car loans. They're the borrowers in this system. The top 10% holds the vast majority of financial assets. They're the lenders. So the answer to who the lender really is? It's wealthy people operating through central banks they control, institutions they own, and investments they hold directly. The debt system is just a mechanism to transfer wealth from poor and middle-class people who borrow to rich people who lend. Now let me show you how this mechanism has worked throughout all of history. Back in medieval Europe between 1200 and 1500 AD, the Catholic Church was the main lender. Kings borrowed from the church to pay for wars. By 1500, the Catholic Church owned 25% of all the land across Europe, mostly acquired by foreclosing on debts people couldn't pay. The Medici family in Florence during the 1400s became the richest family in Europe through lending money. They lent to kings, popes, and merchants. The interest income they earned from lending made more money than any actual business. By 1450, the Medici were so powerful they could literally decide who became pope and influence kings. The Bank of England, created in 1694, was when the debt wealth system became official. King William III needed $1.2 million to finance a war. Parliament gave permission to create a private bank that would lend this money to the government. The bank would collect interest paid by taxpayers, and it would get the exclusive right to create currency. This became the blueprint for everything. Create a private institution with a government-granted monopoly on creating money. That institution lends to the government. Taxpayers pay interest to this private institution. The shareholders of the institution become wealthy through never-ending interest income. The Rothschild family in the 1800s perfected this entire system. Mayer Amschel Rothschild had 5 sons. He sent each one to a different European capital: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. Each son set up a bank in their city. The family ended up lending to every single European government. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, the Rothschilds held more government debt than any family in the history of the world. Nathan Rothschild in London famously said he didn't care who sat on England's throne. The person who controls Britain's money supply controls the entire British Empire, and he controlled the British money supply. By 1850, the Rothschild family held an estimated 50% of all government bonds across Europe. They were collecting interest from every major nation. The wealth they piled up through lending exceeded the wealth of entire countries. J.P. Morgan in early 1900s, America used exactly the same playbook. Morgan lent money to governments, railroad companies, and industrial corporations. By 1912, Morgan controlled banks that held 25% of all financial assets in America. The pattern across 800 years is identical every single time. The people who lend become wealthy. The people who borrow become dependent. Lenders accumulate wealth through interest income without actually producing anything. Borrowers work hard and produce things, but they owe more and more. And the system is designed so the debt can never actually be fully repaid. The mathematical trap is really simple. When money gets created through debt, only the original amount is created, not the interest. This means there's always more debt than actual money in existence. If the total money supply is $100 trillion, but total debt including interest owed is $120 trillion, it's literally impossible to repay all the debt. The only way to pay interest on existing debt is to create brand new debt. You borrow new money just to pay the interest on old debt. This makes the total debt even bigger, which requires even more new borrowing. The debt grows exponentially, faster and faster. This is why global debt has exploded from $40 trillion in 1990 to $317 trillion in 2025, a nearly 8 times increase in just 35 years. The debt basically doubles every 10 years, and it has to keep growing because if new debt stops being created, there's no money to pay interest on the debt that already exists, and the entire system collapses. The people who designed this system understood this perfectly. The Bank of England's founders back in 1694 knew that once the government borrowed that $1.2 million, it could never fully repay it because the interest owed would be more than the money supply. This isn't a bug or a mistake. This is the main feature. Never-ending debt means never-ending interest income. And never-ending interest income means never-ending wealth transfer from borrowers to lenders. Now let me show you who's benefiting from this system in today's economy. In 2024, global interest payments on that $317 trillion in debt were around $15 trillion. That's $15 trillion flowing from borrowers to lenders in just 1 year. Governments pay interest using tax money. The U.S. government pays $900 billion every year in interest on the $36 trillion national debt. That $900 billion comes straight from taxpayers. It goes directly to bondholders. Corporations pay interest by squeezing profits. Corporations around the world hold $90 trillion in debt. They pay roughly $5 trillion in interest every year. Where does that money actually come from? From the gap between what they pay their workers and what they charge their customers. Households pay interest from their paychecks. Households around the world hold $60 trillion in debt. They pay about $3 trillion in interest every year. A family making $70,000 per year, paying $15,000 in mortgage interest and $5,000 in other interest, is sending 29% of everything they earn to creditors. So that $15 trillion in yearly interest payments flows from taxpayers, workers, and households upward to central banks, institutional investors, foreign governments, and wealthy individuals. The top 1% globally captures about 40% of that $15 trillion in annual interest income. That's $6 trillion per year going to 80 million people. The top 0.1% captures 20%, which is $3 trillion going to 8 million people. The top 0.01%, about 800,000 people, captures 10%, which is $1.5 trillion. Just 800,000 people receive $1.5 trillion. Every year in interest income from a debt system where 8 billion people are either borrowers or taxpayers paying that interest. That works out to $1.875 million per person in the top 0.01% just from interest income alone. This is the wealth concentration machine in action. Debt funnels wealth from billions of people to millions to thousands to just hundreds of families at the very top. And the concentration speeds up because interest income compounds on itself. If you're collecting $10 million in interest income, you use it to buy more bonds. which create more interest, which you use to buy even more bonds. Wealth compounds exponentially for the creditors, while people in debt stay permanently trapped making payments. The Rothschild family in 1850 held around $2 billion in assets when adjusted for inflation. Through 175 years of compound interest, that family's wealth is estimated at somewhere between $500 billion to $1 trillion today. They didn't build companies or invent products. They lent money and collected interest for 7 generations straight. This same pattern repeats across every wealthy family. The original wealth might have come from business, but the lasting wealth gets maintained through lending. They own bonds, they collect interest, they reinvest it. The system guarantees their wealth grows forever as long as the debt system keeps running. And the system must keep running because if it stops, everything crashes. Governments need debt to operate. Corporations need debt to expand. Households need debt to buy houses, cars, and pay for education. The entire modern economy is built on a foundation of debt, and debt requires creditors to exist. The creditors are the wealthy, and wealthy people use the debt system to extract wealth from everyone else through interest payments that can never stop, because the debt itself can never be repaid. But this system has a mathematical ending point that's coming. Global debt right now is 330% of GDP. Debt is growing at 7% per year. GDP is only growing at 3% per year. If current trends continue, by 2035 global debt will exceed 400% of GDP. At 400%, the interest payments alone would eat up 40% of everything the world produces. That's completely unsustainable. Something has to break. Either governments default on their debt, which wipes out bondholders but crashes the entire financial system, or governments cause massive inflation, which transfers wealth through destroying currency value, but also destroys people's savings. Or governments impose debt jubilees, which cancel debt but completely restructure society. All three of these outcomes destroy middle-class wealth while protecting the elite, because the elite hold physical assets, multiple different currencies and holdings spread across the globe. The middle class holds debt, local currency that loses value, and assets that aren't diversified. This is completely by design. The system was designed to concentrate wealth both during expansion and during collapse. During expansion, wealthy people collect interest on never-ending debt. During collapse, wealthy people buy assets at fire sale prices from people who go bankrupt. This happened during the Great Depression. When banks foreclosed on family farms, wealthy investors bought those farms at pennies on the dollar. Small independent farmers became tenant farmers working land they used to own. This happened in 2008, when homeowners couldn't pay their mortgage and defaulted. Companies like BlackRock Invitation Homes and private equity firms bought hundreds of thousands of homes at 50% discounts. Homeownership went down, corporate ownership went up. This will happen again in the next crisis. When the debt system finally breaks, middle-class people holding debt will default on their loans. Wealthy people holding assets will buy those defaulted assets at massive discounts. The $317 trillion debt system isn't actually a crisis at all. It is a wealth extraction machine designed to transfer wealth from the many to the few during both the good times and the bad times. And you can't escape it because the system is global and controls everything. You pay interest on your mortgage to a bank that's owned by shareholders who are mostly wealthy. You pay taxes that go toward servicing government debt owned by bondholders who are mostly wealthy. Every single economic transaction you make includes an interest component that flows upward to the top. The average American pays $20,000 every year in direct and indirect interest payments. Over an entire lifetime, that's $1.4 million in interest payments flowing from you to creditors who are, on average, 100 times wealthier than you. This is the system working exactly as designed. Create money through debt. Charge interest on it. Collect that interest forever. Concentrate wealth in the hands of creditors. Make sure the debt can never be fully repaid so the interest never stops flowing. The $317 trillion question finally has an answer. The lender is a small global elite operating through central banks they control, institutions they own, and direct holdings they personally manage. They are the creditors to everyone else on the planet. And the interest payments flowing from 8 billion people to the top few million is the single largest wealth transfer in all of human history, happening every single day, invisibly embedded in every transaction you make. But even when the system collapses, it will still benefit the creditor class because they convert their paper claims into physical assets during the crisis. The system extracts wealth during good times and during bad times. If everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? Now you know the answer. The people who designed the system made sure they would always be the creditors, while everyone else would always be the debtors. And that system, operating through $317 trillion in debt and extracting $15 trillion every year in interest, is the mechanism by which the modern global economy transfers wealth from the bottom to the top, perpetually and inevitably. If this video showed you who actually holds the $317 trillion in global debt, and why the debt system is a designed wealth extraction machine, hit that subscribe button. Because the next video is going to show you the endgame. What happens when $317 trillion becomes $500 trillion? What happens when interest payments exceed everything the world produces? The three possible outcomes: default, inflation, or jubilee. Which outcome are the elite positioning themselves for? And why all three outcomes transfer wealth from the middle class straight to the top? The $317 trillion question has been answered. The $500 trillion question is what comes next. And the answer will determine whether you preserve your wealth or lose everything when the debt system finally breaks down completely.